panel tonight, we have the Conservative Work and Pension Secretary, David Gauke, Labour's Shadow Women and Equalities Secretary, Dawn Butler, the Deputy Leader of the SNP in the House of Commons, Kirsty Blackman, the journalist and radio presenter, Julia Hartley-Brewer, and the author and journalist and Professor of Contemporary Thought at Brunel University, Will Self. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just a reminder at home, you can join in the debate on Facebook. On Twitter, our hashtag is BBCQT. If you're texting, you can text 83981. Press the red button to see what others are saying. Our first question from Busayo Akinyele, please.
My question is, why was the pay cap lifted for some public servants and not all?
The public servants who got their 1% or more this week and not all. David Gauke, why was it only lifted for some?
We've got independent pay review bodies that report every year on various parts of the public sector. There were two that hadn't reported for this year with regard to prison officers and police officers. And they have reported, and we've accepted their recommendations. All of the pay review bodies will report again next year, and we will look at their recommendations.
Why did you change your mind?
Well, what we've...
Because in June, you were voting in favour of keeping the pay cap and telling the unions it couldn't be altered. It's only, where are we now, beginning of September, and it's all gone by the board.
Well, what we've said in terms of public sector pay for some years now is that we have to have restraint, that if we don't have restraint on public sector pay, given where the public finances are, we will see bigger job losses in the public sector. What we are saying is there continues to need to be restraint in terms of public sector pay, but there are clearly some areas where there are shortages, where we need to have more flexibility to recruit and retain the staff that we need. Prison officers being a good example of that, where actually we have done things in recent years in terms of prison officers, but we've accepted the pay review body there. And that's what we're doing. So
does that answer your question, Busayo?
Not really, because the reason why I asked was because obviously the NHS came into question, and I think Theresa May was saying that the next, obviously, they will be reviewing their pay in next spring. So as David said, in June you were saying you won't be looking at it, and then all of a sudden you've changed your mind again. Is this how it's going to be? We say one thing, and then in 6 months' time, we're doing something else.
I think what we're saying is that there is a case for more flexibility. There isn't a case, to be honest with you, we cannot as a country just afford to throw billions of pounds at this because
you're throwing them at the DUP.
We're not in a position where we can ignore the state of the public finances, and that's still got to be controlled. But where we see particular cases where there are shortages, where there is a need to recruit and retain staff more than we're doing at the moment, then there should be a degree of flexibility. I think that's a pragmatic approach to the situation we're in.
Dawn Butler, pragmatic approach. That's how you see it?
Well, I think that was just a long explanation to explain the indefensible, really, because we can afford to pay public sector workers more than inflation if we wanted to, if the government wanted to. It is a political decision not to. And, the Labour Party, we will not play this divide and rule game that the Conservative Party is doing. It's wrong. We would scrap the cap quite simply. That's what we would do as a party, and that was in our manifesto, and it's fully costed. And what the decision actually shows is this decision could have been made sooner and earlier. You didn't have to wait until you were forced to pay public sector workers a little bit more. And actually, it's still not enough. It is still a cut because it's less than inflation. It's outrageous.
What would your policy be? You'd scrap the cap, you'd pay people inflation plus, or what?
We would scrap the cap. That's the first thing we would do, and it was in our manifesto. It's fully costed, because I know that would be the next question: how you're going to pay for it? How much it will cost?
What
it will cost around.
What the unions say they want, or what?
What is costed is if we would scrap the cap. The unions between 2.9% and 5% is what some of the unions are asking for. We've calculated that it will cost £4 billion in order to pay public sector workers an inflation increase. Because at the moment, they've had a pay cut for the last 7 years. And it's unacceptable that our police officers, our firefighters, our doctors, our nurses are working full-time and not being able to eat, go into food banks. It's outrageous.
Just to get to the point, would it be a 3% increase, a 4% increase, a 5% increase? What increase?
It's not. It's calculated. 4 billion is calculated on an inflation increase.
Okay, Julia.
Look, I've got to be honest, I supported the pay freeze and the pay cap as a short-term emergency measure. The reality is actually, as a result of the economic crash, it was the private sector that got hit far more quickly and far harder and for far longer than the public sector. But while I accept the need to handle the government deficit and pay off our debt, there comes a point when it becomes politically unsustainable and practically unsustainable, regardless of whether it's popular or not. And I don't think the government, even if they did announce a pay rise of 3% above inflation, they would get the credit for it now anyway. So you've thrown away that opportunity. But the reality is, if you can't recruit enough nurses at a particular salary, you can't recruit enough police officers, enough prison officers, enough anyone in the public sector, teachers. We have shortages in all of those areas. By definition, you need to pay them more. But interestingly, earlier this year, 3 of the people on this panel, all MPs, took a £1,000 pay rise to £76,000 a year, because you have to pay good money to get good people, apparently. I happen to know a brain surgeon who earns half that. Being an MP, with all due respect, isn't brain surgery, and yet you guys think for some reason that you are worth so much more than people doing frontline public sector emergency jobs, when the economics have told us, the laws of supply and demand have told us, that we do need to pay those people more to recruit enough of them.
You, sir, in the middle there.
Yeah, sure. I think restrain, David. I think it's about MPs tending and saying no to their pay rise. So using that language, I think that's totally unacceptable on public sector pay rise.
What's your view about public sector?
I think public sector pay rise should be all across the board, not divide and rule.
Okay, Will Self.
Well, I mean, it is divide and rule. You're absolutely right. It looks extremely bad for a Conservative administration, traditionally the party of law and order, to have a lot of bolshy police and prison officers kicking off at the moment, and they just can't afford it. It hasn't worked for them anyway. They're very bad at dividing and ruling because the underlying situation, everybody in this room knows what it is. The poor have got poorer, the rich have got richer. When, you know, the kind of mood music we've heard from the Tory party ever since May first appeared on the steps of Downing Street was this idea that this is going to be an administration that's going to be socially inclusive, that's going to move towards genuine equality. There's absolutely no sign of it. It's an administration, in fact, in free fall. It's a wonder David Gauke can sit there. It's amazing he's not travelling towards the centre of the earth.
All right, we'll come to David Gauke again in a moment. You sit in the back row there.
Justify this billion or so pounds they give to the DUP, and you can't explain why you can't give some money to the nurses. How do you explain? How do you explain
Let
that?
David
of
Gauke.
the amount of money that a public sector pay rise above inflation
Don't answer for David Gauke.
But that's not the point, though, is it? The point is that when you want to find money, but when they want to find money for something like to cling on to power, they find
that was
the money.
the point the man's making. So let David Gauke answer it.
Right. First point to make is, although we have had a freeze and then a cap on public sector pay, and there are public sector workers who have had pay increases of only 1% or so, we also must remember that within the public sector there is progression pay. Actually, the majority of nurses last year and the year before had above inflation pay increases. But look, we would all
That's because they were
like
getting
to-
more senior.
But, well, their pay is
That's
going
like
up.
going up, being promoted from sub-lieutenant to lieutenant, lieutenant to...
Well, no, for working a year on, I mean, I don't know,
Yeah.
you know...
So presumably some of them will have a living wage by the time they reach retirement.
Well,
for example.
can I just come back to this point that is often said about inequality? The facts are very clear on this. When it comes to inequality of wealth, the gap in the last 7 years has narrowed. It's not a contestable point. The Institute of Fiscal Studies has been very clear on that. If you look at the bottom 20%, the average household in the bottom 20% of income has increased in real terms in the last 7 years. The top 10%, top 5% has fallen. And the reason why that's happened is because we've got more people into work and more people are working more hours, and we have cut income tax, a cut in income tax, which has also benefited many of the public sector workers that we're talking about today.
Let me bring in Kirsty Blackman.
Over the time of the Conservative government, over the last 7 years, we have not seen real wages go up. So over the last 7 years, you're now earning less than you were 7 years ago before the financial crash. Now, if you ask people in the street, if you ask people in this audience if they feel like they're richer than they were 7 years ago, I guarantee you the vast majority of them will say they're absolutely not richer. Things are costing more money, which is partly as a result of Brexit, but inflation is going up. We are seeing people's wages not keeping pace with that. And actually, the public sector pay cap is one of the issues around this, but there's a much wider issue around wages. And for the Conservatives to say that, you know, pay restraint is important and that we need to reduce public sector spend, these folk are working in really hard jobs and they are doing things that we desperately need them to do. So it's really important that we pay people appropriately.
OK, can I just put a question? I'll come to you in a second. But David Gork, can I put a question your old boss, George Osborne, posed? He just said in his newspaper, it's very confusing. Is austerity over, or isn't it?
Yeah, I would like to know that.
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure...
Answer him. Don't.
Okay.
You know, you don't have to answer me or our audience
yeah.
or 3 million people watching. Just answer old George.
Fine. Well, what I would say to George or anybody else is that we are still in a period of time where we have got a significant deficit. It's come down a long way. Our debt levels as a country are too high. We are paying more in debt interest every year than we pay on wages and salary in the NHS. And if we increase our debt, we increase our debt interest payments, we've got less money to spend on other things.
And that's happening, is it, by this process?
Well, you know, does the government still have to care about the public finances? Can the government just relax about that and say, we don't have to worry about it because we'll borrow and then a future generation can pay taxes to fund our living standards now? I don't think that we can walk away from that issue. And so the point is, I mean, I don't think we're talking about austerity when, you know, we are still borrowing, you know, 40-50 billion pounds a year. But are we in a period where we've got to move towards living within our means? Yes, we are.
It's quite clear that austerity hasn't worked. It's quite clear that austerity hasn't worked.
Meaning what?
Meaning that all the cuts to public services, all the cuts to pay, it hasn't worked because all you're doing is creating a crisis. Creating a crisis in the NHS, creating a crisis in social care, creating a crisis in the police service. All you're doing is creating crises in number 10. It hasn't worked. And why is it that people who are working have to suffer the brunt? Why is it that you can give billions of pounds of tax giveaways to huge corporations? Why is that?
Dawn, you know that the biggest thing we've done in terms of the tax system has been cutting income tax by raising the personal allowance, helping 30 million taxpayers.
That was the Liberal Democrats.
Well, that was I was part of the Conservative Treasury team that did that. We did that under Conservative chancellors. The idea that we can just sort of, you know, forget about how much we're borrowing, not to worry
You
about
could just
it.
print some money, David. Why don't you print some money like you did for the bankers?
There isn't an easy. That's not what... we did.
On this programme, just before the election, your Prime Minister said there isn't a magic money tree. that suddenly provides. She said it to a nurse who was asking why she couldn't be paid more. Now, there is a magic money tree.
No, there's not.
She's shaken it and
no, there isn't.
Well, no, there isn't, because there's no extra money from the Treasury for the police.
Yeah.
The police officers I've spoken to since this are absolutely furious. Forget about this divide and rule. They're furious. This is a one-off 1% bonus. It comes out of the police force budgets, and it's not even pensionable.
Yeah. You said that, and then we must move on. Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I think that Will might have been slightly wrong when he sort of set it against the money that was paid to the DUP. They're exactly the same thing. This is a government that's been humiliated, lost its majority, and it's doing anything to stay on to power, giving away money. It's the same thing. In a few months' time, they'll be giving money to somebody else. And to sit there talking about austerity and fiscal responsibility while doing that is just hypocrisy.
And what do you think they should do? Do you think they should go on restraining their spending, or do you think they should...
I think there should have been a gradual increase. I think the pay freeze lasted far too long.
OK, and you, sir, over here in the check shirt, just briefly, if you would.
I think that you should stop giving the pay rises as percentages, put each pay grade, give them X amount of money, because it always seems to be the people that are at the top of the organisation seem to get more than the people that actually do the work at the bottom.
Because, if you live by percentages, But the fastest pay rises have been, across the economy, the fastest pay rises have been for people at the bottom end, because we've brought in the national living wage. And that's one of the reasons why income inequality has reduced in recent years, not gone up. The woman there in
the teachers on 21.
The woman there.
Yeah, I think that it's not always a solution to put pay caps on workers. What about increasing tax for the wealthiest people in this country so they pay more to contribute towards our society?
The top 1% are currently paying more as a share of income tax than they've ever paid in history.
Yeah. But then obviously society needs more money, don't they?
Yeah,
society needs more money, so we can't just cap workers all the time.
The facts are we have increased stamp duty, capital gains tax, all sorts of things.
If we want workers to get more pay, why don't we all vote to pay more taxes ourselves to pay for them? Yeah. Let's put our own money on our...
OK. We better move on. But just before we do, next week we're going to be in Bridgewater in Somerset. The week after that, Wolverhampton. I'll give the details at the end, but there on the screen is how to apply to be in the audience. I'd like to take a question from Sally Armitage, please.
Is Jean-Claude Juncker right when he said that Britain will live to regret Brexit?
Yesterday, yes, in his speech extolling the progress and virtue of the EU and the way it was going, he said, Britain, we all regret Britain leaving, and Britain... He said, I think he said it actually to the UKIP MEPs, didn't he, who were barracking him. He said, and you'll regret it too. So, will Britain live to regret it? Kirsty Batten.
Yes. In a word.
Succinct answer, thank you.
I lie in bed at night worrying about the outcomes of Brexit. You know, I don't want my children to grow up in a country where we can't have people welcomed into our country when they choose to come and live and work in our society. I worry about the economy. I worry about the impact that the increase in inflation is going to have. We've already talked about inflation going up and the fact that people are struggling to make ends meet as it is. So prices will get more expensive because goods will simply be more expensive. I worry particularly about the fact that it's the UK government, it's the Tories that are negotiating Brexit, and they have shown absolutely no sign of being competent. And I can't believe that we are going into a situation where we are a year and a half away from Brexit. There's no guarantee for EU nationals in our country. There's no guarantee about how the finances are going to work after Brexit. There is just no certainty for anybody. And actually that means that businesses are going to start taking decisions to bail out from the UK as a result of the lack of certainty.
Julia Hartley-Brewer.
Goodness. Well, yes, so Jean-Claude Juncker's speech was quite extraordinary, setting out his plans for a federal super-state, EU army, one overarching president. Tony Blair, are you listening? There's a job for you. An international vetoes, EU taxes, and taking away even more national powers. It was so rare to hear such honesty from the EU, and I just wish that he'd made that speech before we had the EU referendum, because we would have won by an absolute landslide. The reality is that's not what the British people want. That's why people like me, and I note that once again I'm the sole leaver on a BBC panel.
How often are you the sole leaver on a BBC
Most of the
panel?
time.
Every time you've been on this programme, you've been with Nigel Farage, as far as I know.
I've never been on the panel with Nigel Farage.
Have you not?
Never.
Just feels like that.
Perhaps you're not in a majority after all, Julia.
I hate to tell you. I hate to tell you
sink in.
52% of us voted. There's no evidence that anyone's changed their mind. I certainly haven't.
Anyway, you have the microphone, so speak your mind.
Every single thing that Jean-Claude Juncker said was exactly why I don't regret voting leave. If the good folk of our lovely European friends and neighbours choose to go along with the federal superstate, choose to give away their national powers, choose to give away their democracy to a federal superstate, good for them. Carry on, have a great time. I voted to leave, so did more than half of the country June last year, and we did it because this is what we don't want, and I absolutely don't have a single regret at all.
You say, man in the pink shirt. You say, the man in the pink shirt.
Thank you. I thought when we joined the EU, it was to join a common market for sales from one country to another.
Yeah.
Not to have a load of bureaucracy where these people have got very well-paid jobs. If we lose, in the end, if other countries leave and the EU collapses, they must be terrified of what they're going to do in the place of having these jobs.
And do you think people, as Juncker said, will live to regret Brexit, or are you in favour of it?
I voted for Brexit.
Yeah.
We stood on our own 2 feet before we joined the EU. We can do it again.
OK, David Gork.
I think the challenge for all of us in government, in fact all of us in Parliament, is to ensure that we make a success of Brexit and that we don't regret it. As Julia pointed out, I voted and campaigned for Remain last year, but the decision has been made, and what we have to do is get on and deliver it and make a success of it, and ensure that we deal with the potential problems, and that means making sure that we think through how we implement things, that we get a good deal with the European Union, but also seize the new opportunities that may be available outside the European Union.
How well is it going so far?
Well, I think to be honest, it's going fairly predictably. We're going through a tough negotiation where both sides will want to get the best possible deal, and that there's going to be a degree in which people are going to take particular positions. I wouldn't have expected us, to be honest, to be at this stage. Everyone saying, "Oh, it's all done and dusted." That was never what was likely to happen. But there's a lot of work that's going on, and that in terms of there are particular issues like, for example, the citizens' rights, where there's a lot of progress and there's some shared ground. There'll be other areas that will be more contentious. But that is always going to be part of the nature of these negotiations. But it is in our interests and the interests of the European Union for us to reach a good deal, so that we've got a deep and special relationship with the European Union, but a different one from the one that we were in for many years, which the British people voted to leave.
So why did Jean-Claude Juncker say what he said, that you'll live to regret it? What's he got in mind?
Well, I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker, I mean, I do agree with Julia. His vision of the European Union is not one that even I, as someone who voted Remain, found attractive. But he has a particular vision with the European Union, and he wants a much more closely integrated European Union, and believes that those who don't want that are wrong.
Let's hear from more members of our audience. The woman there in white, that second row of the back, yes.
It just seems to me, with that statement that Jean-Claude Juncker made, it seems like we're going to get punished, or they're gunning for us to get punished. And as the lady of SNP you were talking about, you worry at night. I think we all should worry, because I think guns on, they are going to try and make us and suffer, and I think that's very wrong. At the end of the day, we did vote to leave. And I think that should be respected. That's our choice and so on. So why make it hard? Let's just get fair deals for everybody and let's just part ways, but in a very friendly and civilised way.
And you think that's going to happen?
I pray so.
and you?
We've got to stop this tit for tat, and it's on both sides. You know, the European Union, what Jean-Claude Juncker said this week, and then David Davis will say something else, and it'll just go back and forth, and actually just crack on and make some decisions, because we're what, a year past the date of when we voted to go out, and basically nothing's been decided. Businesses aren't making decisions, investment isn't happening, and soon these companies are going to leave the UK for good.
John Butler.
Well, I agree with Kirsty, and the thing is this, is that David Davis has come out of these recent rounds of negotiations and cannot tell us whether we've made any progress. So can you imagine being in a room, negotiating, and you come out and you cannot say, we've progressed? That means that we're in trouble. And just this week, we had the EU withdrawal bill, right? And that's supposed to be about how we leave the EU. Right, so people voted to leave the EU so that we can have control over our legislations and our bills. What the EU withdrawal bill did, we renamed it the power grab bill, and what it is just that Theresa May is trying to just hold on to power any way she can. She doesn't want to come to Parliament and be scrutinised about anything. You don't even trust your backbenchers. What you've done is you've put a law in place where it's just the ministers that are going to make a decision. It's an actual offence to our democracy. And Prime Minister's making a speech next week, and I hope that in that speech, because things aren't going too well in the EU, so she's making this speech to try and smooth things over a little bit. I hope in that speech that you take a leaf out of Labour's book and talk about transitional arrangements. What are we going to do when we're going to leave the EU? What are going to be our transitional arrangements? So businesses, as that young guy said, businesses don't decide to close their doors and leave the UK or stop investing in their staff because they don't know what's going to happen, because of the uncertainty that our government is causing to our country and our economy.
But, Dawn, there's some confusion about what Labour is.
There's actually no confusion. We've been... I'll clear it up. You've been very clear from the start. We've said what we want is...
Sorry, is this today's policy?
The thing is that I'm going to tell you what our policy has always been.
Okay.
So we've said we want a jobs Brexit. That's always been in concrete. We want a Brexit that's good for the country. What we don't want is and what we're seeing is businesses being forced over this cliff. It's like the government's running to this cliff edge to jump over. We're saying, what's the transitional arrangement?
Do you want to be in the single market or not? Do you want a single market deal or not? Because one of McDonald says it's not right to go in the single market. Corbyn says that's what we want, kind of single market. That's what I'm getting at.
No. We've decided that we want to be in the single market and the customs union during this transitional period for as short as necessary, but as long as possible. So while we're negotiating, we need to make sure that we have some stability in what we're talking about.
What do you make
it's a very clear and sensible position to be in.
Okay. You've got no complaints with it as a position?
Well, yeah, when Dawn says we need to take a leaf out of Labour's book, they've got a whole library of books on their position.
Well, take a leaf out of our manifesto.
But in terms, I think your manifesto was a different position from that. But can I just come back on this EU withdrawal bill? Because in terms of the challenge that we face, we've got 40 years of accumulated laws that have come from the European Union that we need to adjust, not fundamentally change. Actually, the point of the EU withdrawal bill is to implement it as part of UK law. But to do that is a huge task. Now, Labour have accepted that we're leaving the European Union, or at least they did when they voted for Article 50. So we're going to leave, but they're not letting us, or they're trying to stop us from transposing all the European law into UK law.
That's not
true. And the only way to do that is through the EU withdrawal bill. That will require use of delegated legislation, which Parliament still scrutinises and can overrule.
That's not true.
And Labour's approach would just leave us in a really dangerous position where we couldn't have a clear set of rules.
No, let's not stick with this. Let's go back.
But it's not true.
Well, all right.
It's a lie.
Okay. All right. Well, okay. There's Juncker is what the question was about. Well, I'll come to you in just a moment, but I'd just like, there are a lot of hands up, and I'd like to hear from one or two more people in the audience. You in particular, so there. Yes? You? Yeah. You?
You criticise Conservatives so endlessly. It wasn't them who had 50 rebellions on Monday. And also, Jean-Claude Juncker is going to laugh at the fact that we can't be unified as a nation. We can't all vote just to leave the... Like, at the moment, scrutiny is not about single market. We must leave single market to leave Europe. It's about how we're going to later on implement Brexit. That's what we should be scrutinising, not this at the moment.
And you, Saab, on the side there?
I wouldn't take what President Juncker says at all. I mean, I wouldn't take it seriously at all. But the wider point here is the stance of Labour and the SNP. It belongs to the period before the referendum. The way it is, looks as if we don't know whose side they are batting for, really, because the other side is saying we're going to be punished. Then it looks as if, yes, we are going to be punished. It looks as if Labour and that Remain side looks to be happy that we, begging our way back to Europe. The whole thing is confusing, and Labour is going to realize that they will be shooting themselves in the foot.
Okay. Man in the blue shirt there.
Do the politicians realise how distant the average working class person is from this idea of an economic doomsday, that the economy is going to collapse? Because when it's doing well, the poorest don't really get to be partake in that. So, we need to accept that Brexit happened, roll up our sleeves and come together and make it work.
Okay, and the woman there, and I'll come to you next, Tim. Yes.
So I suppose this follows on quite nicely from what this gentleman just said.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about the fear of large companies leaving the UK, leaving London and going back to Europe, but there's very little talk going on about what's going to happen to British businesses. So I work in the food industry, and we're heavily reliant on imports from both the EU, but also just, we buy things in dollars. The impact on the currency and the exchange rate, I've seen it firsthand. We're a small business, and we're talking about the impact on working people. I'm actually in a position where I've seen a business have to consider whether we're going to have to let staff go.
Will Self?
Oh, I don't know. It's a pity pickle, isn't it? I think my favourite... I think we will regret it, but we regret everything, don't we? What fascinates me most is this astonishing cleaving to the referendum result, as if it represents some mystical truth that has to be held on to. And my favourite post-Brexit anecdote was a friend of mine was at a lunch attended by David Cameron, if you remember who he was, quite recently, at which the former Prime Minister, in his cups, was heard to bemoan his fate and what had happened to him. And another guest at lunch got up and came over to him and said, "Not even my golf club alters its rules by a simple majority vote," and walked out. We don't live in a direct democracy, but if all of those who are so intent on talking about fighting to preserve the result of the referendum and its importance in our democracy were actually involving themselves in our democracy and reinvigorating it, then I wouldn't be so worried about Brexit. And frankly, if the people who were negotiating our leaving the European Union didn't present such a sorry spectacle on the international stage, I might be a little bit more confident.
What's sorry about the spectacle?
Well, for a start, who they are. Liam Fox, a man who tried to fiddle his expenses so his personal assistant could share his hotel room. David Davis, well, some intellectual calibre, but an also run and a has-been who's there. And Boris Johnson, we all know about him, don't we? It's no wonder the Europeans are laughing at us when this trio comes into sight.
All right, I have to give David Gauke a chance to reply.
I'm not sure there's much that's worth responding to there, to be honest. Look, the reality is...
Well, why don't you respond to it, actually, David?
Well, because it was patronising claptrap towards 52% of the population.
It's not patronising claptrap. No.
patronising for the 40% who voted Remain. This continuity Remain thing, led by Tony Blair, Nick Clegg, and clearly by you. I think most of the British public have had enough of this. We say this is time to move forward. We're going for Brexit. It's happening. We decided to have a vote. We had the vote. If you believe in democracy, you accept the outcome.
Let's allow David. And let's allow David Gork to reply. He's about to
First of all, we've had the referendum. There was a decision. It wasn't the decision I wanted, but it was the decision of the British people, and I do think it has to be respected. Secondly, one of the things about a referendum of that sort, there is a risk, and we clearly saw that it can become very divisive. But I do think that, I don't want to sound too pious here, but frankly, if we could conduct political debate not on the level of personal abuse, but perhaps on the ideas that we hold and what people are trying to do and what we actually do, that would be good for politics and good for the country. And as the gentleman said earlier, we do need to work together, we do need to unite, and it is responsibility not just on government members, not just on Conservative MPs, but parliamentarians across the board to work together to try to get the best possible outcome here. And of course there are going to be differences of views, and we're a vibrant democracy, and that's how it should be. But I think it would be a lot more helpful if we did it on the basis of the substance rather than getting into personal abuse.
I'll take one more point. The woman there, yes, and then we must move on to
from the perspective from a European migrant where I am, now that Brexit happened and UK is leaving the European Union, is it not time for the government and the Brexit campaigners to explain to the public that the reason why the immigration was not controlled is because the government chose not to do it? Because there is directives from the European Union, because as European Union's migrants, by coming to UK, we're exercising our rights to come. And other countries, other European countries, got measures that put in practice by European Union that you can put in practice, UK could have put in practice to stop the flux of the European migrants to this country. But since it didn't happen, and I keep hearing as a European migrant that we voted to control our borders, to stop our borders, it was never shut because they were not put in practice what it was advised by European Union. So as the 3 million of us that are now sitting and we don't know what's going to happen to us, is it time now that the government is a bit more honest and say that we're the one that chose not to impose these measures? So by they coming to UK, they're exercising their rights, not coming here to steal, but to exercise their rights as citizens from the European Union.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's go on to another question. Hilary Ossay, please. Hilary Ossay.
In light of the Grenfell inquiry opening today, will we actually get any concrete answers as to why the disaster happened?
Will Self.
Well, if I'd been Cressida Dick in charge of the Metropolitan Police, I would have had officers round to Kensington and Chelsea Council and to the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation on the morning after the Grenfell fire and would have made some arrests before people's shredding machines got going. It's now 3 months since the Grenfell Tower fire, and with every day that's gone past, the likelihood of securing the convictions, and I mean criminal convictions for criminal irresponsibility, that we need in this case, retreats into the distance. And I've no doubt that Sir Martin Morbeck is entirely a straight guy and a good person to have in charge of the inquiry and will do his level best to root out the guilty people. But I think a lot of people in London, and particularly those, I mean, Julia was talking about it earlier on, particularly those in West London who see the charred and calcified corpse of that block every day, see it as a kind of symbol of one law for the rich in this city and one law for the poor, and are very worried, particularly since we learned today that only 2 of the Grenfell Tower families have been rehoused in 3 months, have been permanently rehoused. We're getting very, very worried that there won't be justice, either justice now in terms of adequate aid for those affected, or justice in the future in terms of bringing the guilty parties into court.
Dawn Butler.
I think that Grenfell was a terrible, terrible national tragedy, and I think that they've been let down time and time again by the council, by the government, and this inquiry, I think, needs to be wider. The scope needs to be wider. It needs to talk about social housing. One of the survivors says that it's like living it all over again, and there's one rule for the rich and one rule for the poor, and we're treated as less than human. And I think we need to have full facts and full disclosure so that justice can be served.
Do you think that's not going to happen under Morbick's chairmanship?
I'm yet to be convinced. I think that the inquiry is very restricted in the people that are on there. There's not one person of colour on that inquiry, and I think that's shocking. And I think that when you have people around the table who kind of all think the same way, you get a misrepresentation, so people will see things through a different lens. Grenfell was filled with people from all different walks of life, and I think that that needs to be represented. And I think the other thing is lessons need to be learned. And how are we going to know what lessons need to be learned if the difficult questions are not asked? So, and I also think it's a disgrace that only 2 or maybe 3 people have been housed, because they were told by the government that it will take 3 weeks and everybody will be rehoused. And there's lots of people still living in hotels. And there's just not been, you know, in the richest... It's the richest council that we have in London, and you've got people who, instead of spending £10 million on fitting sprinklers, they spent it on making it look pretty for, you know, the richer residents. It's a disgrace, and I just think, you know, it's an indictment on our government and on our country.
You, sir.
I very much hope that the truth does come out, but we live in a culture where every organisation seems to want to protect its own image and to avoid any kind of legal comeback. I just wish that after a tragedy like this, we could change the culture so that we're prepared to put our hands up and say, we, as a council or a fire brigade or a manufacturer, didn't do our job properly. And if we could create a culture where it was okay to say that, and where the media applauded us for being honest and telling the truth, then I think we would get to the result of the situation much more quickly.
Okay, and the man in front of you, do you agree with him?
I think there's more wide failings than that with the Grenfell situation. So you've got, even in the aftermath, you've got people that have made attempts on their own life because they don't have adequate support in the aftermath of dealing with the trauma. People aren't being rehoused. So I think not just the council needs to be looked at, but the funding for the NHS to help deal with the people with their struggles after the issue itself, because that's quite a significant issue.
But Hillary's question was whether we get answers as to why the disaster happened. Do you think that will come out of the inquiry?
I think I heard today that there aren't actually any representatives from people that actually lived in the block themselves sitting in on those meetings, so where would they get the proper information from?
You on the front row there.
Yes. Grenfell wasn't a tragedy, it was an abomination. It epitomises how we as people have been let down by local and central government, and every time there is a problem, it's always hidden under the actual table. So we will never get answers. It will take forever for somebody to actually admit the truth, that they actually put themselves and money first instead of people's lives. So
why do you think that won't come out from this inquiry?
Because it's done by politicians, and politicians who are the ones that actually let all those people down, and they're never going to admit to their failings.
Well, I mean, also, people talk about the underlying culture, but surely the culture we need to address is a country in which people are demonised simply because they live in social housing. It's as simple as that. And the kind of, you know, why was this block covered with this cladding? It was covered with the cladding so that the rich people who lived in the streets around it didn't have to look at how shitty it was.
Absolutely.
It's right, and it's why many, many other of these old point blocks have been covered with similar cladding as well.
All right, David Gorg.
The question is, will we get to the truth? And that's the purpose of the inquiry. And there are 2 elements to this. You know, precisely what happened, what went wrong in this appalling tragedy. And secondly, how do we ensure that it never happens again, that there aren't other tower blocks where the same thing might happen? Now, Sir Martin Morbick is independent. He comes with a distinguished record as a judge. He will be receiving, of course, representations from the local residents. Their legal support is being paid for, so they're getting full legal support to make any representations that they want to the inquiry. And I think we have to listen very carefully to the conclusions that Sir Martin Morbick will reach. And I think that has to be the approach. But can I just come back to one thing that Dawn said, which was, there are two big elements about this. One is learning the lessons and discovering what really happened. Secondly is the support for the survivors. And there were clearly things that went wrong in the early days after this event. But there's been a lot of support that has been provided in terms of, first of all, on housing. I mean, everybody was offered temporary housing within 3 weeks. The objective now is to ensure that everybody gets permanent housing within 12 months. There's something like £76 million being spent in order to deliver that. A lot of the people have chosen to stay in hotels rather than move to temporary housing, and we have to respect that decision.
Yeah, but the question, sorry to interrupt you, the question is about the inquiry which opened today and whether there'll be concrete answers. And I note that Martin Morbick himself said he was doubtful the inquiry would be as wide-ranging as some residents hope. What do you think he meant by that? And does that mean it's not the right kind of inquiry, that it should have been broader in its scope?
Well, he has set...
Not as wide-ranging as some residents hope.
Yeah, I mean, he has set his own terms of reference, and he's done it for the reason there is a trade-off here, that the broader and broader you make an inquiry, the longer it takes, the less focused it might be.
So what's he excluding, in your view? What's he not going to discuss?
I mean, the issue that some local residents are saying it should be a sort of a wider focus and looking at social housing policy. I mean, he is looking at, at what happened in the specific case, but also sort of more widely in terms of what are the fire regulations and so on. Now, in terms of sort of social housing policy, that is something that is, going to continue to be debated. It's something which, as a government, we're focused on and what we can do to improve social housing. But, just be clear.
You're going to let councils build it,
well, actually, I mean, on council housing, we've built twice as much in the last 7 years than was built in the previous 30 years.
Let's come back. Let's go there. Kirsty Blackman, what do you make of the inquiry?
I think it's really important that the inquiry does what it can to get justice. I understand that there are families that will never. You can never provide the answers because sometimes the answers are just not there about what happened. I think it's horrendous what happened. I used to live in a council block of flats in my city, and I completely understand the concerns that residents have about things like access, and I can understand why there are residents in other blocks that are concerned. What we've said all along is that the inquiry should make sure that it listens to the residents, that it's guided by them, that it's guided by the survivors and the families of the people that died in the tragedy. And I think the most important thing for me is to make sure that they have a fair hearing and that the questions that they want answered are properly answered. But my concern is like yours, that I'm not sure that's going to happen. I don't know whether or not it can.
Okay, Julia.
I think a lot of the lessons were already learned. I thought they were learned quite a long time ago. For instance, after the Lakanal fire, in which 6 people died in 2009 in South London. I would have thought the lesson that you don't put flammable cladding on high-rise blocks was a lesson that you didn't have to need 80 people to die to learn. I've got no knowledge of building regulations or fire regulations, and I could have told you that. My 10-year-old could have told you that. And indeed, I was fascinated to learn in all the interviews I've done on this on my talk radio show that apparently I, with no qualifications whatsoever in this field, would be legally entitled to sign off a block as fulfilling building and fire regulations without any of those qualifications. I think we may have spotted a flaw in the regulations. It also seems to be very obvious that you should have sprinkler systems. £9 million was spent on this refurbishment. An extra £60,000 would have meant of cladding that didn't go up in flames.
But do you think Sir Martin Morbick will get to the bottom of this? Everybody's got their ideas about why it happened.
But
David, Julia makes the right points, but the other point is the whole kind of timeline. No, seriously, you're making the right points, but the whole...
Thank you.
But I'm not trying to patronise you.
Could I answer the question David asked me? Thank you. So what was it again? Is he going to find the answers? I think the answers are already there. Absolute horrific incompetence, greed and criminal negligence on the part of the tenant management organisation, the council, and probably the government as well, because we already knew there should be sprinkler systems, we already knew the cladding was flammable, and it was allowed to happen.
No, all I was going to say, Julia, is there was already a paper trail of all of that on public record. That's why I was saying the Met could have made some arrests.
I think Hilary Osei, who asked the question, what do you think?
I would like to think we're going to get some concrete answers, but to be honest, I really doubt it. I mean, since it's happened, it could be this, it could be that, you know, maybe it was this. We haven't had anything definitive, and I think it would be great. It will bring some sort of peace to those that actually, you know, they suffered through the disaster. And actually, those, for instance, I live in a block of flats, and I know after it happened, I was deeply concerned about could this flat be there? Could it happen here? So I think, as well as for the survivors, for those of us that, you know, live in apartment buildings and tower blocks, actually it would help to bring us peace as well, to know that actually it will never happen again. And it should never happen again in 21st century London. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes left. I want to switch subjects completely and take a question from Simon Greenberg, please. Simon Greenberg.
Given that many believe Jacob Rees-Mogg's views to be extreme, does religion have a place in politics?
Rees Mogg, who said abortion in any circumstance, including rape or incest, was morally indefensible and has been attacked for this during the week. Does religion or these views have a place in politics? Will Self?
Yeah, of course religion has a place in politics. I mean, how could it not? If you profoundly believe something, and you profoundly believe something about the nature of the world, the existence of a deity, what that world's for, then it's going to affect your political perspectives. You can't somehow purge people's deep spiritual and philosophic beliefs from their political ideas. And, you know, whatever you think of Rees Mogg, there's a virtue in honesty, isn't there? At least he's spoken his truth. You know, I mean, it's much more sort of mealy-mouthed, a la Blair, in fact, to pretend that you're a deeply religious person, but that somehow it doesn't affect your politics. That's casuistry of the first order.
But do you remember the former Liberal Democrat leader?
Yeah, I was thinking of him as well, but I couldn't remember his name because it's Tim. I can't remember those. Tim F. Tim F. I can't do Tims. But yeah, the Tim guy, he had the same problem as I didn't buy that.
No, but he said he couldn't live as a committed Christian and hold the Bible's teaching while being a political leader.
Well, I suppose he had a problem with presenting himself in a way that he felt his electorate wanted to hear. In other words, he couldn't convince the people he wanted to vote for him to vote for him as a religious person. He was probably right to leave public life.
Because the Tory party members want him as your substitute for Theresa May, don't they? Or next Prime Minister.
I think that remains to be seen, David. I think that's
what
premature.
they say.
That might be a little premature, I think.
It's not exactly scraping the barrel, is it?
So what do you think about
Well, I mean...
Can you hold those views and still be Prime Minister, which is perhaps...
I think I mean, look, I disagree with Jacob's views on this matter, but you know, he holds them honestly and sincerely. He's open with the electorate. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that when it comes to issues on conscience issues, if you like, they tend to be on the basis of a free vote in the House of Commons. A party leader, whether it be Prime Minister or Leader of the Opposition, has no more say, no more influence really than any other Member of Parliament. There are plenty of Members of Parliament who have held the views that Jacob holds. They're not my views. I don't think, as a matter of principle, that we can't have a devout Catholic as Prime Minister. But on this particular issue, I have to say, I
it's a funny
disagree with my
point of
colleague.
principle that you couldn't have a devout Catholic.
Yeah, it would be. That's very quite.
Curious. Simon Greenberg, what do you think?
I personally think that religion as a institution is a bit of an archaic thing.
A bit of an archaic thing?
Yeah, I don't think that religion really has a meaning in life. Personally, well, the top 3 or 4 anyway. Things like Buddhism and other smaller religions that are more about spiritualism or something like that. potentially, but...
Some religions have a place in politics, but not others.
Yeah.
What's your view? In the front here.
Frankly, right now I am applying to Oxford for philosophy and theology, so I think I know a bit about religion. And I personally am a devout Catholic, and all of my... Because if you truly believe in a religion, if truly you believe that God is the person who created this world, that we live for God, then your politics is also going to be based on your religion. And there is nothing wrong with having God as your principle. Why should God come after contemporary principles like equality, like tolerance? Why should I? Oh well, but they are contemporary Enlightenment principles. And why should I sideline God in order for them? And actually, they made a response not only to Jacob Rees Mogg, but also to Tim Farron. Shows just how much the contemporary person demonizes someone who is a devout believer. The way that someone cannot hold a theologically
Man
consistent...
behind you is shaking his head as you're speaking, just very briefly, and then I must go around the panel.
First of all, thank you for your CV about applying to Oxford. Not relevant at all. But I think the issue is actually, if you have those views, it's how you deal with them. So Rees Mogg has been, whether you agree with them or not, he's actually been honest about it. And that's rare in a politician, whether you agree with that or not saying I do, but actually we're seeing someone who's actually laying themselves out. And I mean, Theresa May is criticised for being the Maybot and not showing any emotion or anything like this. It's kind of... Okay. You can't win.
Kirsty.
I completely disagree with Jacob Rees Mogg's views. He's also said today something about the fact that the rise in food bank use is a good thing.
He didn't say that.
Which is really concerning. So I disagree with his views, but I have argued a lot for Parliament to be more representative. I think what we should have in Parliament should reflect what we have in society. So I think we should have more people from minority ethnic groupings. I think we should have more women in Parliament, and I think we should have more people from religions that are not represented in Parliament, and also more people of no religion in Parliament. I think the whole of Parliament should represent what society is like, and I've argued for that, and so absolutely I believe that there's a great place for people of Christian faith or people of other faiths in Parliament.
Julia?
Can I just say on that point, I don't think we should be electing people on the basis of their religion or their gender, their race, their colour of view. I find this identity politics very worrying. Simon, who asked the question, don't you love the fact you live in a country where you can say there should be no place for religion in politics, and you're not being carted off by the police right now? Because in a lot of countries, largely not Christian countries, interestingly, that is what happens. I very much agree with Will, which is not something I think I'd say very often. That I do think it is very, for the obvious reasons,
You should agree with me more.
I think it's very, very strange that so many people complain that politicians don't tell the truth and say they just say what we want to hear. And when a politician does tell the truth and gives his personal views, people shout, not only you can't say that, but what we've had in the last week about Jacob Rees Mogg, and again, I completely disagree with his views. Interviewed him today on my radio show.
You've mentioned your radio show twice.
Cunning, isn't it? Cunning. But it's
talk radio, is it?
It is. It's
Okay.
Genuinely, it's the fact that we now have not even you can't say that. We have you can't think that. We have the thought police now in this country, and we should fight against that because that is very, very dangerous.
Dawn Buck. Last one.
I think if Simon had said to me, you know, would I rather have more religion kind of in politics or more Jacob Rees Moggs, I'd say I'd want more religion in politics. But yes, okay, I completely disagree with him, like everybody else.
What do you mean, like everybody else?
Well, everybody else on the panel have said that you disagree with what he said. And I think it is a worry that people are talking about him to be the next Prime Minister with those views. And I do worry about people who would want to go and see him in his constituency, who might want to go and see him on sensitive matters, knowing that he holds those views as their MP. And I think that's a little bit worrying for me.
I've got the same expression here. Yeah.
All right, there we are. I'm sorry, our time's up. Apologies to those of you who had your hands up. We only have an hour and we've overspent it. So that's all from Question Time tonight.